The torch sputters in your hand, spitting sparks as if it knows what waits ahead. Heat presses in from the braziers that line the marble corridor, each flame bending against a sudden gust from the open windows. The night air carries the brine of the harbour mixed with something sharper, acrid, a smell that does not belong in a sanctuary of scrolls. The marble beneath your sandals is warm, though the hour is late. Somewhere beyond the walls, voices are shouting, clashing, then falling silent. The city is restless, and you feel the unrest creeping into the library's veins. Your fingers skim brittle papyrus, the crackle louder than your breath. This is Alexandria's heart, a vault of voices that could vanish if your torch dips too low. The papyrus rolls stacked in cedar shelves feel dry and rough as scales. They rustle faintly under your touch, as though whispering secrets in languages you cannot read. Scrolls from Babylon, hymns from Egypt, mathematics from Greece. Each one feels heavier than bronze, though it is weightless in your hand. A guard passes by, spear clinking against bronze armor, eyes fixed straight ahead. He does not look at you, a scribe, a shadow among giants. You clutch the torch tighter, sweat beading on your palm, aware that one slip of flame could erase the work of centuries. Outside, hooves thunder against cobblestones. The sound rises, stops, then splinters into shouts. Orders barked in Latin. A crash of wood, the clash of steel. You freeze, your torchlight spilling across the rows of shelves that stretch higher than a man can reach. The shadows they cast look like spears. Another guard rushes past, his sandals slapping stone, his eyes wide. You catch the sharp smell of smoke again, heavier now, carried on the wind from the harbour. It seeps through the open arches, staining the air inside. You step toward the doorway, past scholars still bent over their wax tablets, scratching furiously as if the world outside does not exist. Their heads glisten with sweat in the torchlight, quills moving faster, lips moving in half-whispered calculations. One raises his gaze to you, eyes hollow and red-rimmed, then drops it again. To stop writing would be to admit the danger is real. You step out into the colonnade, your torchlight meeting the night sky. The horizon flickers orange, not with stars but with fire. The wind carries embers into the courtyard, glowing sparks that drift and die before they hit the ground. The marble statues seem to shiver in the shifting light, gods frozen in alarm. The noise swells, boots hammering, voices cursing in foreign tongues. A scroll slips from your hand and unravels across the stone, inked lines curling in the draught. You stoop to grab it, but your torch dips lower, flame licking too close. For an instant you imagine the whole hall igniting, rows upon rows of voices shrieking in silence. Your hand trembles. You know the choice before you. Save the scrolls, or save yourself. And for the first time, you wonder if knowledge is more fragile than fire. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, Alexandria pulsed with ambition. Ships crowded its double harbour, their masts a forest of wood and rope, their hulls heavy with grain, papyrus, and glass. At the city's heart rose marble colonnades and broad avenues lit with oil lamps that glowed against the night. The city was not yet old, but it carried the weight of destiny. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by the Ptolemies, Alexandria was designed to be more than Egypt's capital. It was to be the meeting point of the known world. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigned in those years, dreamed of something greater than palaces and ports. He sought to capture the entire memory of humankind. He ordered his officials to gather every text, every scroll, every fragment of wisdom that could be found. Ships docking in Alexandria were inspected. Their manuscripts, whether Greek tragedies, Egyptian hymns, or Babylonian star charts, were seized by royal decree. Scribes copied them in the library's scriptoria, sometimes returning the copies, often keeping the originals. This hunger for knowledge was not hidden. It was policy, ambition turned into a law of empire. The Mausoleum, or Temple of the Muses, became the center of this experiment. It was more than a library. It was a research institute where scholars lived, ate, and worked under royal patronage. Within its courtyards, the world's finest minds gathered. Callimachus began cataloguing the holdings into the Pinarches, a guide to tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps the first attempt at something like a universal index. Zenodotus, the first head librarian, compared manuscripts of Homer and attempted to create a definitive text, line by line. Other scholars experimented with medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, the halls alive with argument and discovery. What made Alexandria's library different from any before it was its scale. Earlier collections had been treasures of kings guarded in palace vaults. Alexandria's library was not simply for storage, it was for study. The Ptolemies invited foreign thinkers, offering stipends, housing, and the prestige of working at what was quickly becoming the most important intellectual hub in the Mediterranean. It was a place where a physician from Egypt might argue with a philosopher from Athens, or where an astronomer from Babylon might share the stars with a poet from Rhodes. Knowledge no longer belonged to one land. It belonged, at least in vision, to all who could read it. By the end of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the library had become a legend in its own time. Scholars spoke of its holdings in numbers that seemed impossible. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls stacked in cedar cases and hidden in alcoves that stretched higher than a man could reach. Whether the figures were true or exaggerated mattered little. What mattered was the dream. Alexandria was not only a city of marble and sea, it was a city of memory, a place where rulers tried to gather the wisdom of the world and hold it against the forgetting that time always brings. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, Alexandria had become more than Egypt's capital. It was a stage where the ancient world performed its brightest ideas. Marble streets stretched wide, their stones polished by sandals and chariot wheels. At the city's heart, the Mausoleum gleamed, a temple not only to the 9 muses of Greek tradition but to knowledge itself. Here the library stood, not as a silent vault but as a living organism. Its corridors smelled of ink and cedar. Its walls echoed with debate, the scrape of styluses on wax tablets, and the rustle of papyrus unfurled for study. The scholars who worked here lived under royal patronage. They dined together in communal halls, their meals punctuated by argument over astronomy, medicine, or the proper order of Homer's verses. They were not simply readers, they were builders of knowledge. Euclid refined the principles of geometry, laying down axioms that would become the skeleton of mathematics. Herophilos dissected human bodies and mapped the nervous system, daring inquiries that few cultures had permitted before. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth with nothing more than shadows and calculation, coming within a startling margin of truth. Beyond science, language itself was reshaped within these walls. Philologists compared variant manuscripts of Greek poetry, weighing words like coins, seeking the most authentic lines. Callimachus compiled his Pinarches, a vast catalogue that not only listed works, but organized them by subject and author, the ancestor of every library index to come. The work was monumental. It acknowledged that knowledge was too vast for any one man to master, that even scholars required guides to navigate the sea of words. The presence of the library also transformed Alexandria's streets. Sailors spoke of its hunger for scrolls. Merchants knew that goods brought to the harbour were subject not only to inspection, but to intellectual seizure. A play in Athens, a treatise from India, a chronicle from Mesopotamia, all might find their way into cedar cases before the ships were released again. The library's appetite gave the city an aura of prestige, but also of unease. Foreign rulers complained that Alexandria stole what others had preserved. Yet the Ptolemies cared little for such criticism. To them, this was not theft, it was inheritance, the rightful gathering of wisdom into the hands of empire. In this way, Alexandria became something larger than its marble and stone. It was an experiment in cultural gravity, drawing minds, manuscripts, and ambitions into its orbit. In its courtyards, a physician from Egypt might overhear an astronomer from Babylon describing eclipses, while a poet from Greece recited verses newly corrected by library scribes. It was a crucible of civilizations, a place where ideas rubbed against one another like flint on steel, sparking insights that spread far beyond the Nile Delta. For a time, it seemed as though Alexandria had captured not only the goods of the world but its soul. The city stood as proof that knowledge itself could be gathered, catalogued, and refined, made to serve rulers and scholars alike. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the library's greatness carried the seed of its peril. What is gathered can be scattered. What is preserved can be undone. No one alive today can say with certainty what the Library of Alexandria contained, yet even in antiquity its holdings were spoken of with awe. Ancient writers whispered of hundreds of thousands of scrolls, some claimed 400,000, others 700,000, the numbers swelling like legend with every telling. Whether exact or exaggerated, the truth lay not in the count but in the scale. It was a collection without rival, a mountain of memory pressed into papyrus and ink. Imagine stepping into its halls. Cedar chests lined the walls, their lids lifted to reveal tightly rolled manuscripts stacked in neat layers. The air would have been dry and pungent, laced with resin, ink, and the faint musk of parchment. Each scroll bore a title tag affixed to its end, scribbled in Greek, Egyptian, or one of the many tongues that funneled into the city. Works of Homer and Sophocles rested beside Egyptian hymns that traced lineages older than any Greek poet. Babylonian star charts lay unrolled near treatises on mathematics from India. Histories of kingdoms long vanished might have waited there, names and laws preserved only in the silence of those shelves. The library's appetite reached beyond literature. It was said to hold medical texts that mapped the body, astronomical works that tracked the wandering stars, manuals on mechanics, and philosophical debates copied from every known school. Some believed it preserved knowledge centuries ahead of its time, discoveries lost to flame and neglect that might have altered the course of history had they survived. Was there a device of steam or gear that foreshadowed the machines of later ages? Were there charts of distant lands that might have brought the world together sooner? These questions linger not as facts, but as shadows, haunting because the answers were consumed with the scrolls themselves. For the Ptolemies, the collection was not simply treasure, it was power. A king draped in silk was wealthy, but a king who commanded the written wisdom of civilizations was formidable beyond measure. The library was a monument of soft power, a vault where knowledge itself was currency, traded and hoarded like gold. Its existence reshaped the politics of scholarship. To be copied into its collections was to gain immortality. To be withheld from it was to risk obscurity. Visitors to Alexandria spoke of the library in reverent tones, describing it not merely as a building but as a cosmos contained in walls. It was said that to walk its corridors was to walk through time itself. Voices from Egypt, Greece, Persia, and India gathered under one roof, harmonizing or clashing but never silent. It stood as the closest humanity had ever come to a universal memory, an attempt to hold the world in words. Yet this very ambition carried a subtle fragility. Papyrus was light as a reed, ink no stronger than dust, and fire always waiting in the shadows. The library held the wisdom of ages, but it also held a weakness no ruler could defend. The more knowledge it gathered, the more it risked losing everything in a single spark. The Library of Alexandria was never merely a storehouse. It was a fortress of memory, guarded as carefully as a palace. To enter its halls was to step into an environment where every word mattered and every scroll carried both promise and danger. The Ptolemies knew that knowledge was not a passive treasure. It was a weapon, and weapons required control. Royal decrees commanded that ships arriving in Alexandria surrender their manuscripts. Captains and merchants might protest, but their protests carried little weight. The scrolls were taken, copied by scribes, trained in multiple languages, and then catalogued into the pinarchies, the sprawling index Callimachus devised to navigate the collection. Often, the originals never left Alexandria again. Foreign rulers accused the Ptolemies of theft, but the kings saw it as duty, the rightful gathering of wisdom into their empire. Inside the library, a strict hierarchy shaped the flow of work. Scholars debated in shaded courtyards, their voices sharp with argument over philosophy or science, while rows of scribes bent over benches, their reed pens scratching across fresh papyrus. The scholars dined at royal expense, free to pursue their inquiries without concern for livelihood. The scribes, in contrast, were shadows, unseen except in the labor of their hands. One class produced questions, the other preserved answers, and both were necessary to sustain the library's vision. Not all the tension came from within. The very act of centralizing so much knowledge drew jealousy and suspicion from abroad. Athens had once been the intellectual heart of Greece. Pergamon in Asia Minor had risen to prominence with its own library, and scholars drifted toward Alexandria as moths to flame. The Ptolemies encouraged this migration, offering stipends and prestige, but rival courts resented the drain of talent. A battle of libraries unfolded, silent yet fierce, where prestige was measured not by soldiers but by scrolls. The guardians of the library understood that security was not only physical. Ideas themselves were volatile. A philosophical treatise could challenge royal authority. A medical text might reveal knowledge that unsettled tradition. Even as the Ptolemies collected everything they could, they also sought to regulate interpretation. To gather wisdom was one thing, to control its meaning was another. The balance between preservation and censorship was as delicate as papyrus itself. Yet, for all its careful hierarchy, the library was alive with energy. A physician might pass a mathematician in the courtyard, trading observations about anatomy for insights into measurement. An astronomer might overhear a poet, their languages colliding but their imaginations sparking. Knowledge was not locked in the chests. It breathed, argued, and collided in ways the kings could not entirely predict. Still, the fragility remained. The papyrus was brittle. The walls, though strong, could not keep out the chaos of a city caught between empires. The library stood as a guarded sanctuary, but one that depended on the discipline of men and the restraint of flame. Even as scribes worked tirelessly, the threat was always near, waiting beyond the marble arches. In the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, Alexandria became a battlefield. Julius Caesar, entangled in the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII, brought his Roman legions into the city. The marble streets that once rang with debate now echoed with the clash of steel and the shouts of soldiers. For the first time, the library's survival hung in the balance of war. The siege unfolded in chaos. Caesar's forces, pressed hard by the Egyptians, set fire to the ships in the harbour to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Flames roared across the docks, their heat rising like a furnace, their smoke curling into the sky. The wind carried sparks beyond the ships, into the warehouses where papyrus scrolls were stored for transport. Ancient writers later disagreed on the details, but many believed that the fire spread farther, reaching the library itself, devouring works collected over generations. Strabo, the geographer who visited Alexandria decades later, wrote cautiously, speaking of losses without certainty. Plutarch claimed that the flames destroyed as many as 40,000 scrolls, while others insisted that only the annex near the docks was consumed. Whatever the truth, the image endured. Scrolls blackening in fire, shelves collapsing in heat, knowledge turned to ash. The destruction became a symbol, even if scholars still debated whether the main library had been spared. Within Alexandria, panic spread faster than the flames. Citizens crowded the streets, shouting over the roar of collapsing timbers. The harbour glowed orange, its reflection trembling in the sea like molten metal. Soldiers trampled through alleyways, their armour slick with sweat, their voices coarse with orders. Somewhere in the confusion, scribes must have watched helplessly as the work of lifetimes curled into smoke. The air would have been thick with ash, acrid in the throat, bitter in the eyes, every breath a reminder of what was slipping away. Yet even in the aftermath, the library did not vanish entirely. The Mausoleum still stood, its scholars still working, its scrolls still copied and catalogued. Perhaps only part of the collection was lost. Perhaps the greatest treasures survived, protected deeper within the temple. The fire was not an ending but a warning, proof that the library's ambition was fragile, vulnerable to the accidents of empire. For centuries afterward, the memory of Caesar's siege haunted Alexandria. It became the first shadow over the library's legacy, the moment when the dream of gathering all human wisdom nearly died in smoke. Whether the loss was 40,000 scrolls or far fewer mattered less than the fact that fire had touched the library at all. The idea of its invincibility was gone. And once that illusion shattered, the decline could only creep closer. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria did not come in one night of fire. It came in fragments, scattered across centuries, each wave of turmoil eroding what had once seemed eternal. If Caesar's siege was the first crack, the centuries that followed widened the fracture until little remained but memory. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, Emperor Aurelian marched to reclaim Alexandria from Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. His troops stormed the city, burning districts and leveling defenses. Accounts suggest that in the chaos, whole quarters were reduced to rubble, including the Brutian, the royal district where the Mausoleum had once stood. Even if the library survived Caesar's flames, it may not have survived Aurelian's soldiers. The sword and torch often achieved what neglect could not. A century later, under Emperor Theodosius I, the empire turned against the old religions. In the year 391, he decreed the closure of pagan temples. Alexandria's Serapeum, a grand temple to the god Serapis, became a focal point of violence. Christian mobs, fueled by zeal and sanctioned by law, tore through its halls, smashing idols and burning sacred relics. Some sources claimed that the Serapeum had become a refuge for the library's surviving collections, scrolls housed in alcoves and annexes. If so, the destruction of the temple meant another library consumed by smoke and fury. Whether or not every scroll was lost that day, the event became another layer in the legend of Alexandria's unraveling. Even without fire, time itself waged war on the library. Papyrus was fragile. Without constant care, it cracked and crumbled. Scribes could copy only so much, and each political upheaval scattered the workforce. When patronage faltered, scholars drifted away, leaving scrolls untended. What had once been a living forge of knowledge began to wither into silence. The ambition of kings could build marble halls, but only steady hands and patient minds could preserve their contents. Without them, the vault of voices grew brittle, fading like ink left too long in the Sunday. By the 5th century, Alexandria was no longer the unchallenged capital of knowledge. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, monasteries in Ireland, and universities in Italy and Spain began to claim the mantle of intellectual leadership. What remained in Egypt became fragments of a dream, scattered scrolls in private hands, stories passed down of what once had been. The city still bustled with trade, still glittered with its lighthouse, but the library's spirit flickered, diminished, its once boundless vault reduced to echoes. The unraveling of Alexandria's library was not a single tragedy but a chain of them. Caesar's fire, Aurelian's conquest, Theodosius's decree, the neglect of time. Each acted like a tide against stone, wearing away the dream until it was no longer whole. The library did not fall with a roar, but with a long sigh, vanishing piece by piece until silence claimed what ambition had gathered. By the 7th century of the Common Era, Alexandria was no longer the proud jewel of the Ptolemies, but a city fought over by Byzantines and Arabs alike. In the year 642, the armies of Islam marched into Egypt under the command of Amr ibn al-As. The city surrendered after fierce resistance, its harbours quieted, its walls lowered. Amid the transfer of power, a legend was born, one that would cling to the library's name for centuries to come. Later writers, especially in the 13th century, told a story that Caliph Umar, upon learning of the library's vast store of scrolls, decreed their destruction. According to the tale, he declared that if the texts agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they contradicted it, they were dangerous. The scrolls were said to have been distributed to the city's baths, their papyrus burned to heat water for months. The image was vivid, scrolls dissolving into steam, wisdom evaporating into the air like mist. Yet historians have long doubted the account. Earlier Muslim chroniclers made no mention of such an event, and many suspect the tale was invented by later writers seeking to frame Islam as an enemy of ancient learning. The practical details also raise questions. Could scrolls centuries old, fragile and crumbling, truly fuel the baths of a great city for so long? Was there even a single intact library left by the 7th century to burn? Or had the collection already faded, lost through fire, neglect, and conquest long before the Arabs arrived? What matters is not whether the story is true, but why it endured. The legend of Umar's decree became another layer in the myth of Alexandria's loss, another attempt to explain how so much knowledge could simply vanish. The tale revealed humanity's unease, the recognition that the greatest treasury of words had no clear ending, only rumors and speculation. In the absence of certainty, people created stories, and the story of the Caliph's decree became a parable about the fragility of wisdom in the face of power. Even if the baths never smoked with papyrus, the legend spoke to a deeper truth. Knowledge does not need a single night of fire to perish. It can vanish in neglect, in conquest, in the indifference of rulers who fail to protect it. The story of Umar captured that truth in the starkest possible image. Scrolls reduced to ash and steam, voices silenced not by time, but by decree. By the time the tale was first written, the library was already gone, its halls forgotten, its scrolls scattered. But the legend gave the loss a face, a villain, and a moment of finality. It turned uncertainty into myth, and myth into warning. The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is measured not only in what was destroyed, but in what can never again be known. Every account of its fall, whether through fire, neglect, or decree, leaves the same question echoing in history's halls. What wisdom vanished with those scrolls? The possibilities stagger the imagination. Did it hold the complete histories of vanished civilizations, their laws, their poetry, their maps of lands long swallowed by time? Were there medical treatises that might have described the circulation of blood centuries before it was rediscovered in Europe? Could astronomers of Babylon or India have left behind observations that would have hastened humanity's understanding of the stars? Might mechanical devices, described in ink and diagram, have foreshadowed the gears, pumps, or even engines that only emerged in later ages? The loss is not simply academic. It is visceral. Imagine a physician in Rome in the 1st century struggling to heal with herbs and superstition, when in Alexandria perhaps there lay a scroll with clearer knowledge of anatomy. Imagine sailors groping blindly across oceans without compasses, while a map sat forgotten in a cedar chest. Imagine philosophers debating in ignorance while somewhere, in a sealed alcove, a voice had already answered their questions. Each scroll burned or left to rot was a door closed forever, a possibility erased. Some argue that humanity's progress was delayed by centuries, even millennia, by the library's destruction. Others caution against such speculation, reminding us that knowledge is not only discovered, but must also be understood, shared, and applied. Yet the weight of the loss remains. Even if the library contained no hidden engines or cures, it certainly held voices that will never be heard again. Poets whose verses could have altered the shape of literature. Historians whose accounts could have reshaped the way we see the past. Entire traditions silenced not by choice, but by chance and neglect. The haunting power of the Library of Alexandria lies in its silence. We cannot list its treasures, for the lists themselves are gone. We cannot measure the scale of its loss, for the scale itself has crumbled. What remains is the awareness of absence, a void in memory that no archive can fill. Every library built since then, from Baghdad's House of Wisdom to modern digital collections, is haunted by the question of what was lost in Alexandria. The absence has become its own kind of presence, a reminder that knowledge is fragile and that what we fail to protect can vanish without a trace. Though the Library of Alexandria crumbled into myth, its spirit never truly died. In the centuries after its decline, new centers of learning rose, each carrying a fragment of its ambition. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad gathered scholars from across the Islamic world, translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. Monasteries in Ireland and Italy copied manuscripts by hand, safeguarding theology, philosophy, and science through the turmoil of the early medieval centuries. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford eventually inherited the dream, becoming the new engines of intellectual life. Alexandria's legend shaped all of them. The idea of gathering wisdom into a single place, of collecting the memory of civilizations, became a model for every great archive that followed. When modern libraries rose in Europe, their founders invoked Alexandria as both inspiration and warning. The Vatican Library in the 15th century, the British Library in the 17th, and later the Library of Congress in the young United States all echoed the same ambition: to bind the world's voices into one chorus. The story of Alexandria's loss also served as a caution. It taught rulers and scholars alike that knowledge must be guarded not only against fire and conquest, but against neglect. A single generation of indifference could undo centuries of preservation. The fragile nature of papyrus became a symbol of the fragile nature of memory itself. Even as technologies advanced, from parchment to print to digital code, the ghost of Alexandria hovered, a reminder that even the greatest collections can vanish if they are not protected. In modern times, the library's name has become more than history. It has become metaphor. Writers speak of it as the ultimate symbol of human curiosity and the ultimate warning of human failure. To lose Alexandria is to lose a part of ourselves, a recognition that knowledge is both treasure and responsibility. Efforts to rebuild, such as the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened in 2002, carry that weight. Its soaring architecture and vast collections are not merely cultural projects, they are acts of remembrance, tributes to a dream that first flickered beside the Mediterranean 2 millennia ago. The Library of Alexandria may never be recovered, but its afterlife continues to shape how humanity sees knowledge. It stands as a paradox, both lost and eternal, destroyed in fact yet indestructible in legend. The halls may be gone, the scrolls scattered, but the dream remains, carried in every library, every archive, every attempt to gather and preserve the wisdom of the world. Step back now from the marble halls, from the smoke of siege and the whisper of scrolls. What lingers of the Library of Alexandria is not the cedar chests or the papyrus rolls, not the scholars hunched in lamplight or the guards pacing the colonnades. What remains is absence, a silence so vast that it still unsettles us 2,000 years later. The library has become less a place than a question, a haunting reminder of what it means to lose memory itself. Its destruction, whether in Caesar's fire, Aurelian's conquest, Theodosius's decrees, or Umar's supposed command, has never been recorded with certainty, and perhaps that is fitting. For the story of the library is not about one night of flames, but about the fragility of human achievement. Knowledge is not stone, it does not endure by its own strength. It endures only through care, through copying, through constant vigilance. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that the greatest threat to wisdom is not merely fire or conquest, but neglect. Yet its legend also carries resilience. Every library since has lived in its shadow, inspired by its dream. When a scribe in a medieval monastery bent over parchment, he carried Alexandria in his silence. When scholars in Baghdad translated Greek into Arabic, they carried Alexandria in their ambition. When the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened its doors, it carried Alexandria in its very name. The library may be gone, but its spirit has never left us. To think of Alexandria is to think of possibility. What might have been learned, what might have been built, what songs might have been heard, what cures found, what stars charted. The loss is immeasurable, but so is the reminder it gives. That knowledge is a flame, fragile yet radiant, and that every generation must decide whether to guard it or let it gutter. In the end, the Library of Alexandria is both tragedy and triumph. Tragedy because its shelves are empty. Triumph because its dream endures. To remember its silence is to vow that our own libraries, our own archives, our own digital vaults will not fall to the same silence. Alexandria is gone, but the hunger to know remains, restless as ever.